So let's talk briefly about vascular plants. So they can exist in many different forms and occupy different niches in aquatic environments. They have a more complex structure. They're differentiated into tissues, right? Unlike single-celled organisms or even colonial or filamentous or sheet like structures seen in some of the other algae. They have tube-like vascular bundles for nutrient transport. And they can exist in different habitats such that they can be attached and have floating structures. They can be attached at the bottom and have portions of them, photosynthetic portions or flowering portions, floating. They can be submerged. They can be emergent, where they have parts of them that are actually coming above the water. And let's take a look at some of those. So emergent plants, I'm sorry this is so hard to see. It should have been grayed down so you can read it more readily. But the emergent plants have the roots and basal portions that are growing beneath the surface, typically in very shallow water. But the leaves and the stems are mostly above the water surface. And a lot of the common species that we'll see around here include cattail and pickerel weed and many of the sedges. So they're found primarily, again, in shallow, littoral waters. So littoral means waters where sunlight is able to penetrate through, and you have rooted plants along the shallows. So here's some examples of it where you don't have to bother reading it. So this is pickerel weed, both the stems and the leafy portions, as well as the flowering portions, are above the water. And here's cattail. Here's a stand of cattail over here. And you can see some of the water doesn't always have to be covering them. A lot of these cattails are growing in what looks like mud that is not covered by water at this point in time. So this might be just part of a dry season. But nevertheless, these cattails that's a pretty nice, healthy stand. And here's what an individual cattail would look like. Here are some sedges. A lot of times you can see they're spiked inflorescence, looking like this in the upper right. And if you were to take a feel of their stem, they're triangular in cross-section. Some of them can actually be pretty sharp, but you can sort of remember that it's a sedge because sedges have edges, that triangular cross-section that you can see here in that image on the right bottom. And so now let's look at some of the floating, unattached representatives. They float with the majority of the plant above the surface of the water, but if there's any roots that they hang free into the water, they're not anchored to a substrate. They can move about freely with wind and water currents, and so examples of this on the left is water lettuce. Water hyacinth is shown in the middle. It's actually a really beautiful plant, but it's considered a noxious weed because its uncontrolled growth can clog canals and harbors. And duckweed on the right, which is a much smaller floating plant, and you can get a feeling of the scale or size of this plant as some of the duckweed is being held with forceps, turning the duckweed sideways to show its root structures below. Here's another floating plant, which is actually a water fern called azolla. And these are not uncommon. They have sort of a fuzzy, furry-looking presence above the waterline. And it can actually fix nitrogen. Oftentimes, a species of Anabaena can be associated symbiotically with the azolla. And there's some really interesting metal cobalt nutrient requirements associated with the symbiont. And if the cobalt is not in the water, it actually affects the symbiont and then affects the azolla, and they become chlorotic, or their chlorophyll is not as robust. And the chlorophyll is not showing up as much in that left azolla as it was in the right. So other pigments are now showing through in that unhealthy plant because of the lack of cobalt. So these are floating plants that are not emergent, and they include a lot of the lilies, and they are attached to the bottom substrate, and I'll reproduce this for you so you can actually read it. None of these are coming out on this slide such that you can read the text. But essentially there's usually a long, slender attachment to a point of anchoring or roots, and leaves will be floating on the surface, as well as flowers. Examples of these include lotus. They can be really beautiful. They're an important part of the water gardening industry. They're also a vital and common community member in a lot of non-flowing water types. And lotus is also, the roots of which are very commonly used as food in many parts of Asia. And they're served here as well. Shown the root there in cross-section in a soup. So here's another submerged aquatic plant. This one here is a whorled, this is coonwort. But a lot of these guys, although they can be anchored by root systems, a lot of times the growth will be so hardy that a lot of the growth will actually come out of the water, even though as a group they're still called submerged aquatic plants. So examples of that on the left, on the upper left, is Anacharis. It used to have another name, Elodea, some years ago, and that is commonly found in lentic bodies of water, non-flowing fresh water. It's also available in the aquarium trade for freshwater aquarium hobbyists. And below it is Hydrilla, which looks a lot like it, but it has has spiny ribs, and the leaves are more serrated. And Hydrilla is considered a pest species that's been imported and is also choking waterways. And we'll hear about the biocontrol of a lot of these different plants when Dr. Kuda, Jim Kuda, comes in and talks about biocontrol. Other examples is parrot feather, or myriaphyllum in the middle, as well as coontail shown again here on the right. These are submerged aquatic vegetation, vascular plant examples. Here's an example of milfoil, myriaphyllum, that is growing in such densities that it's clogging water canals. And so this is an imported species that has become invasive, where it has come in either from transport from other places because of the aquarium trade, or in some cases from ballast waters. And it takes off and does really well in our environments here, and is able to supersede the growth of naturally occurring vegetation in this case, and therefore it's considered an invasive species, and a variety of different mechanisms of controlling it, including literally raking it out, and using biological measures of control are being used for milfoil, hydrilla, and other species. All right, so with that, I'm going to stop. This has been the most broad overview of aquatic vascular plants and algae that I can provide.